Over the weekend, a large, eclectic group of people, including civil servants, housewives, and retirees, lined up all over Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, to join the Bolivarian militia. They were responding to calls from President Nicolas Maduro to volunteer following the deployment of U.S. warships off the Venezuelan coast. The mass turnout was meant to send a message to Washington that the Venezuelan people would not be cowed by America's might. It's a message echoed by Oscar Matthias, a 66-year-old auditor who recently signed up. Speaking with the AFP, he said, "I'm here to serve our country. We don't know what might happen, but we must prepare and keep resisting." Although most experts believe that the U.S. will not invade Venezuela, tensions are still at an all-time high, primarily because of fears that the U.S. will instead launch a small tactical strike similar to what we saw in Iran earlier this year. If that happens, it risks dragging the entire region into a conflict, and depending on the target, might even have an impact on the Russia-Ukraine war. So, how do we get here? What's happening now? And more importantly, where does the region go next? How did we get here? Before we dive in, a quick bit of housekeeping. All the information in this video is up to date at the time of recording. That's noon. Wow, bang on. Central European Time. Due to the fact that our crystal ball is currently now functioning, anything after that obviously won't be covered. So, if you're sitting there in shock on Wednesday morning as crack Venezuelan troops storm Washington, D.C., just know that we apologize for our lack of psychic powers and promise a follow-up video as soon as possible. That disclaimer out of the way, let's tackle the first of our major questions. Just how the heck did we get here? To answer, we need to take a brief detour to 2017 during the first Trump administration. The Venezuelan crisis had been raging for 7 years, and several of Trump's advisors raised the possibility of a military intervention. While there were significant members of the administration who opposed this plan, on the 11th of August of that year, the president told reporters he wouldn't rule out the military option. To say that Venezuela was in uproar is a little like saying that post-Endgame Marvel movies have been somewhat bad. What the hell was I thinking? Vladimir Lopez, Venezuela's Minister for Defense, criticized Trump for his statement, calling it an act of madness and supreme extremism. The rest of Trump's first term unfolded in a similar manner. Trump, or one of his officials, made an inflammatory remark, and the Venezuelan government hit the roof. An important fact from this period is that Marco Rubio, at the time a senator, suggested a military invasion of Venezuela in at least 2 meetings with senior Trump officials. The suggestion was shot down, but we brought it up to demonstrate Rubio's thinking toward Venezuela. Rubio has made a name for himself as a strident opponent of Maduro, going so far as to recognize Edmundo Maduro's opponent in Venezuela's 2024 election as president-elect. And that's a pretty fair point given that all signs point toward having won. But it was still inflammatory, wasn't it? Trump's appointment of Rubio as Secretary of State then was a strong indicator of what his posture toward Maduro would be during a second term. On the 13th of January 2025, 7 days before Trump's swearing in, Maduro suggested that Venezuela, aided by Brazil, should invade Puerto Rico and free its people. In response, Puerto Rican Governor Jennifer González Galán wrote to Trump claiming that Maduro was an open threat to the national security of the United States. Soon after, reports emerged that Trump's team wanted Maduro gone, and, I quote here, "the way of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad." Although we don't quite have it in writing, it's not much of a stretch to say they wanted Maduro replaced. And really, who could blame them? The Maduro regime is one which has plunged its people into biting poverty, threatened neighboring Ghana with invasion, rigged elections, and spread instability in countries like Colombia, where it is the main backer of Marxist guerrilla group ELN. Yet, these geopolitical shenanigans aren't what the Trump administration focused on. Instead, they honed in on the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, trying to have them declared a state-sponsored international terrorist organization. According to immigration policy analyst Alexandra Vrial, This was meant to justify extreme enforcement measures against Venezuelan immigrants, many of whom were in the United States to flee the Venezuelan crisis. Although the courts shot this down, the Trump administration did declare another Venezuelan gang, Cartel of the Suns, as a specially designated global terrorist group. The administration further alleged that Nicolas Maduro was the leader of that gang. This move coincided with two other important decisions. First, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi doubled the bounty on information that led to the arrest of Maduro from $25 million, the same amount as Osama bin Laden, to $50 million. Second, Trump secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon to start using military force against drug cartels this administration had designated as terror groups. It is this directive that the military cited when deploying warships to Venezuela. The deployment currently includes 3 guided missile destroyers, an amphibious squadron, at least 4,500 sailors, and some 22,000 Marines. Officially, the Navy is there to combat drug trafficking. However, given past statements from the Trump administration, some regional observers fear that this is a veiled attempt at either regime change or an invasion. Certainly, that's the focus the media has run with in endless, breathless pieces. But how likely really is the scenario here? Will the U.S. invade Venezuela? Now, at the start of this video, we mentioned that most experts do not expect the U.S. to invade Venezuela. And that's partly because of something Trump said. Speaking to Fox News in 2020, the president said, "If I wanted to go into Venezuela, I wouldn't make a secret about it. I wouldn't send a small little group. No. It would be called an army." While the force currently deployed to Venezuela would be terrifying to be on the receiving end of, it falls short of what the U.S. would consider an army. To fully appreciate what the U.S. considers an army, we need to go back to the Iraq War, where at its peak more than 170,000 troops were deployed. The U.S. believes in the doctrine of overwhelming force, and to do that, it needs numbers. According to the Substack Latin America Risk Report, should the U.S. ever decide to invade Venezuela, there will most likely be an aircraft carrier, plenty of support, and tens of thousands of personnel to actually do the fighting. The U.S. would also pull in regional allies to provide locations for troops, equipment, and logistical support. Talking about the size of the deployment only answers the question of whether the U.S. can invade Venezuela. It doesn't address whether the U.S. should do it. And, well, should's a complicated question in geopolitics because a nation's needs are constantly evolving. For Washington, the calculus isn't just about toppling Maduro, it's about whether doing so advances American interests. And at the moment, the answer is no. First, while the U.S. could easily topple the Maduro regime, a government so unpopular it would make even karma look like the reincarnation of Winston Churchill, the stabilization process would risk dragging Washington into another forever war. After decades and billions spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions, isn't it? Americans are war-weary, and as William Waldorf wrote in Time, pursuing unpopular wars can create a lot of public resistance to wars that are in the national interest. I mean, just look at how many Republicans turned on the idea of supporting Ukraine despite not a single American soldier being on the ground. Trump, in part, rode to victory in 2016 by being the only GOP candidate to call the Iraq War a disaster. Would he really risk the peacemaker reputation he desires for another Iraq-style quagmire? Second, the U.S. wouldn't have the legal authorization or the regional support to carry out this war. Now, you could say the same for Iraq, but again, that was a painful experience that Washington does not want to repeat. And this time, the U.S. would be unlikely to have even a single regional ally on side. For all Caracasas meddling in Colombia, not even Bogotá is going to stand behind a U.S. invasion force. Third, and perhaps most importantly, an invasion risks worsening the already dire humanitarian conditions in the country. For years, Venezuela has exported an eye-watering number of migrants. Migrants the U.S. is now targeting for heavy-handed deportations. Would Trump really be willing to risk millions more fleeing to America at a time when immigration is such a hot topic? After all that, you might be asking, but Simon, A full-scale invasion isn't the only option. What about a small tactical strike like you mentioned earlier? Well, that is also complicated. For the U.S. to conduct a precision strike, it would need to preemptively take out Venezuela's air defense system. These systems, including the anti-T-2500, were primarily acquired from Russia and have Russian operators helping with maintenance and security. Taking them out risks antagonizing Russia at a time when Trump seems to be making yet more overtures to Moscow about peace in Ukraine. Even if Washington somehow manages to thread that needle, there's the issue of target selection. There are 3 possible targets for such a strike. One would be President Maduro himself, given the rhetoric coming out of Washington. However, that carries with it the inherent risk of making Maduro a martyr for people to rally around. And should the Americans fail, it will allow Maduro to portray himself as the victim. Second, there's the Russian-built ammunition plant. While this is the clearest military target on the list, hitting it carries an even greater risk than hitting the air defense systems given the money that Russia has spent building it. Finally, the U.S. can choose to strike directly at the drug cartels within Venezuela, which carries with it not only the risk of civilian casualties, but unleashing a tidal wave of anti-Americanism across Latin America, where leaders are already worried about the U.S. taking unilateral action on their soil. But now, let's consider a third alternative, one where the U.S. neither invades Venezuela nor launches a targeted strike. In such a scenario, why would Washington need a strong presence in the region? One possible reason is as a bargaining chip with the Venezuelan government to get it to step up in the fight against drug trafficking. In the days since U.S. ships arrived in Venezuelan waters, Caracas has sent 1,500 troops to its border with Colombia. According to Das Dardo Capella, these troops are meant to ensure peace and combat criminal groups in the region. Quoting him, "Here we do fight drug trafficking. Here we do fight drug cartels on all fronts." The minister also announced the seizure of 53 tons of drugs so far this year. This is a move aimed at showing the Trump administration that Venezuela is willing to play ball. And for Trump, such a move may be enough to mollify him. And finally, there's another underappreciated reason why the U.S. may have sent such a powerful force to the Venezuelan waters: to deter any possible aggression from Venezuela towards Ghana. As you may recall from our recent Situation Room episode, there are signs that Caracas has not surrendered its dream of annexing Ghana's oil-rich Essequibo region using gang infiltration and gray zone tactics to keep Georgetown on edge. This naval deployment may simply be Trump's not-too-subtle way of saying, "Don't you dare." What happens next? So that leaves us with one final question. What happens next? Well, at this point, nobody knows. We are just as likely to wake up tomorrow and find that all the American ships have suddenly sailed back to port as we are to see reports of fresh deployments. The reality is the future hinges on 2 moving parts: what Maduro does next and how far Trump is willing to push this standoff. Maduro has positioned himself as the defender of Venezuela's sovereignty, while signaling to Trump that he may be willing to come to the table and negotiate and give Trump what he wants. And while Maduro is about as trustworthy as a talking snake offering you a bite of a delicious apple, being able to say that the Venezuelan autocrat caved to his demands on drug gangs might be the sort of thing that Trump would love to crow about. Trump, on the other hand, needs to navigate being tough on Maduro if he can strike this balance. He gets to go into midterms with a significant foreign policy win under his belt. This means that U.S. presence in Venezuelan waters could be as much about optics as it is about geopolitical strategy. Meanwhile, the rest of the world can only wait to see how this all plays out. Both Russia and China have invested heavily in Venezuela, and any U.S. military intervention runs, turning the country into another proxy war. This is the worst-case scenario. But, the 2020s have done a pretty good job so far of making sure that worst-case scenarios come to pass, haven't they? So, where's that leave us? Well, balancing on a nice edge, waiting to see what happens next. These next few weeks will be decisive, telling us whether this story will one day be a mere footnote in the history of this decade, or the prologue for a far more interesting, far more terrifying chapter. Thank you for watching.